you all for coming out on this rather wintry and not very nice night in January in Washington, and Friday night no less. My name is Lissa Muscatine. I'm one of the owners of Politics and Prose. It's great to have all of you here, and on behalf of my husband and co-owner, Brad Graham, who's over there, and our great staff, we welcome all of you to this evening's event. Just a few little housekeeping things for those of you who have not been here before. The way the evening will work is that our guest will be doing, has only been out, I think now for a few days, right? Or a week, or it's certainly within a couple weeks. But he's already been on Colbert, on NPR. He's working his way through a rigorous few stops on a cross-country book tour. He's going off to Canada tomorrow, and he's going to be on the West Coast and other places. You probably also know, if you know anything about him, that in addition to a busy writing career, he's also an ambassador for UNICEF, a member of Human Rights Watch's Children's Rights Advisory Committee, and he runs his own foundation. However, I just want to say, as a mother of 3 children, that I think his most important and most challenging and perhaps most time-consuming job still is ahead of him. He and his wife are about to become parents. So congratulations to you both, and an early welcome to fatherhood for you. So very good news. Ishmael was here at Politics and Prose for his first book back in 2007. And those of you, and I'm sure most of you, read A Long Way Gone. In fact, there are a few million people who I think at this point have read it. You know, if you did read it, that he's a master storyteller, a lyrical writer, and a man with a message. And although he hasn't been a professional writer for all that long, his work has already drawn people around the world to an often overlooked, sometimes neglected place, Sierra Leone and West Africa, and to a deeper understanding and appreciation of the people who live there and their experiences through war and beyond. While his first book was a memoir that exposed the raw violence and moral compromises he experienced as a child soldier during the Civil War in Sierra Leone in the 1990s, his new book is a novel. It's his first work of fiction. It explores life after war, what happens to a community, its traditions and customs, once a period of violent conflict ends. His writing is, as he explains in the first opening pages of this book, infused with the oral and folkloric traditions of his native country, and reading Radiance of Tomorrow, one instantly appreciates the simplicity and the power that these elements bring to his work. Ron Charles, many of you know, is a very tough critic in the Washington Post, but he summed up Radiance of Tomorrow this way in a quite glowing review this week. He said, "This is not the story of that carnage," referring to the war, "nor is it a story of post-traumatic stress, despite these horrifically ripe conditions. Radiance of Tomorrow negotiates a delicate space somewhere between psychological realism and tribal fable, letting the stories of these people cycle gently through without any amplified drama." What a wonderful and impressive start to your career as a fiction writer. I do hope everyone here, and not just you, but your friends, your neighbors, your relatives, your coworkers, people you just meet on the street or the bus, will read this book and find it as evocative and illuminating as we have here at Politics and Prose. So please join me now in welcoming Ishmael Beah to Politics and Prose.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me again at Politics and Prose. It's always a pleasure. And also, I want to extend my gratitude to all of you for making the time to be here on this rainy, cold night. When I was on Colbert's show recently, he asked me if there are things.
You're taller than me. There you go.
If there are things that what are the things that I miss about my country, Sierra Leone? And I said everything. And I said particularly at this time of the year, the weather, because and I even offered him a trip if he wanted to. He could do the show from there anyway. One thing. So I'm gonna jump right into it, because what I really want to speak about is why I decided to write this book and how the idea came about, and some of the things that I try to do in this narrative. And then I would illustrate some of these things by reading a few short paragraphs from the book itself, so you will see what I'm talking about. When the first book came out, A Long Way Gone, and I was traveling a lot about it, for it, I began to think, just observing people and people's reactions to my country, Sierra Leone, and to generally any other place that has had a sort of devastation, that there was a strong interest when the devastation was occurring, when the bloodshed was taking place. But as soon as it ends, nobody pays attention. We drop out of the news immediately. As if when they sign a signature that says the war has ended, everybody just sort of walks back to their towns and villages and start living very well and happy lives, you know. And so for me, these questions were pulling at me. And I also was going back home frequently, as I do, and I was observing the difficulties of trying to return to what people had been, to what communities had been. Is that really possible? Can you get back what you had lost? Can you repair some of the traditions that have been damaged during the war? If so, how do you do that? When you return to some of these towns and villages deep in the countryside in Sierra Leone where some of this narrative is set, you go to places where you're going to live next door to neighbors who had been associated with the war in various ways. Some who had been soldiers, who are coming to live next door, young people whose role in the community had changed because during the war they gained a sense of power, you know, and they didn't respect the elders. So that trust has been broken. How do you repair that? Also, the traditions, the storytelling has ceased for many years. So how do you infuse that knowledge, that wisdom back into the younger generation? There are people who return in this narrative who are amputees. One is an amputated father whose children were amputated and he returns. How does he learn to live in an environment that doesn't have produce him the assistant to do that? Why do people even go back home? What sort of nostalgia do they go back for? And what stories have they told your children who they bring back? Because at the end of the war, there were children who were born during the war, who experienced the war, and now they're young adults. There are people who were born at the very end of the war who do not have any knowledge of the violence that took place in this. And they've been told stories, the great stories about this land. And how do you try to recreate some of those nostalgia and some of those stories that you've passed on to them? So these are some of the things that I was thinking about. And my writing style, when I think about writing things, I've written fiction before, but mostly short stories. When I am writing fiction, particularly, I spend more time thinking about the characters and the landscape that they inhabit, and try to find the right language to fit that landscape. Because this is, for me, I believe that when you write about a place, the language has to fit that place, otherwise it doesn't work. For example, the elders in my village, or in most African countries, will not say, they would not say, you guys, or they will not say you guys to children. They will say children, boys or girls. To say you guys is a very American usage of being in New York. So if an elder in my village was saying to children, hey, you guys, come over here, it doesn't work, for me at least. So I try to find a way to get the language back so that people can really come. And this comes from my experience with the oral tradition. As a kid growing up, when you tell a story to somebody orally, what you have to do is to capture them, their imagination, and take them to a place and keep them there until the story is over, and then you release them. And how you do this is through visual cues, through having them actually experience the feelings that you're talking about. So if you wanted to show them that somebody hesitated, you have to make them feel that hesitation. So when I write, I draw from some of this knowledge. And also, I'm fortunate enough that I come from a place that has a beauty in that tradition, but also in the languages that we have in Sierra Leone. So I incorporate some of this and try to find the English equivalent to some of the things that I wanted to say in this book. And it's not always easy. As a boy, I went to school, and Sierra Leone being a former British colony, English language was sort of emphasized and pushed upon us, and we were told it was the most important thing you could know. And our languages were considered vernacular, so when you spoke them in school, you actually got a lashing, 5, 6 sometimes. But when you're learning English language at a very young age and you're having a vivid conversation with your friends and you run out of the English words you knew, you naturally go to the language that you know. And so as a boy, I began to learn some of the shortcomings of the English language, if you will, and how you can really play with the language to make it yours. For example, in my mother tongue, Mende, how you would say night came suddenly in English when you translate, it means the sky rolled over and changed its sides. So you can actually see the arrival of night. So if I were to write, oh, night came suddenly, oh, right, the sky rolled over and changed its side, all of a sudden the language is a bit more interesting, in my opinion, all right? A ball. In English, it's a ball. In Mende, it's called fefete, which means a nest of air or a vessel that carries air. So you have the component of what carries the air itself. So if I were to say children kicked around a vessel that carries air or nest of air, it's different, right? And you can feel that that language has been spoken. And this is how people speak in my culture. Older people, younger people speak like this in my culture because it's a very, the beauty is in the language itself and the way people express themselves. Now any kid could say this. It's not the most amazing thing to say. It's just the language is like that. Now, for example, but if you're in the capital city, this is what I try to do in this novel. Young people who have been dissociated from some of these traditions during the war do not necessarily speak like that. So when I was writing, I was making a careful negotiation between who spoke like this, which were the elders, because that's how they speak and that's what they know. So they first encountered the land again when they return. In this setting, they go back to Imperi. And the story starts with an old lady who starts walking back on the path to this town called Imperi to start cleaning up even the very bones, because when wars end, you have to clean up even the very bones. Sometimes people don't think about it. During war, when people are being gunned down, nobody's going around and burying them. Everybody's running for their lives. So when the war ends and you return, you have to clean up even the bones to start living there again. You have to make the place livable. You have to find a way to even trust in the spirit of that town again. For example, another example I'll make is that before the war, if you saw a young man walking down the path with a machete, nobody flinched or hesitated when they encountered that young person on the path. After the war, that became different because the image of a boy, for a young man with a machete, now had two connotations. One, he must be going to the farm to cultivate. Two, he could be trying to do something else with it that you don't want to think about. So how do you learn to change that hesitation? How do you learn to trust in that place again? So I look at some of these things as well. Now, to speak a little bit about language as well, when I'm using it in my narrative, in this particular novel, even nature itself is a character. So everything is playing a part because I grew up in the village and I observed some of these things. How we behave corresponds to how nature behaves and vice versa. So what we do to it, for example, the paths react to human presence. The houses react to human presence. If you go to a village that people hadn't lived in for a number of years, the grass begins to grow inside the houses. But if people start living there, the grasses withdraw because they know that it's no longer their place and there's the presence of the people is there, so you can feel that. So I try to write about all of, to bring up these sort of things in there. For example, if another example that I'll make, if you say somebody's thoughts were scattered, the expression that people would do is that, your mind is like an anthill filled with smoke. Now, if you think about it visually, that's exactly what happens. If you take a firewood with smoke and you put it in an anthill, all the ants will scatter and start running around, right? So when your thoughts are scattered, that's the expression, right? When you talk about a bicycle, if you live in the capital city, your Mende or whatever, Timini or whatever you speak will be anglicized a little bit because you're speaking Creole in addition to it. So if you say a bicycle, you will say bicycle in Mende, which is bicycle. Because we don't have that particular object in our culture, we don't have a name for it. But there is a name for it that's a much deeper English Mende word, which is the sound that the bicycle makes. So, and the bicycles that we have are these old Chinese models. So the bell goes like giri-gijin, so it's called giri-genje, which means that, the sound that it makes. So how do you, so when I'm writing, I have all these things in my head. And one last thing I'll make before I read is also, when I was a kid growing up, these traditions were part of my life. They're still part of my life. And even before I ever knew I was a writer, I knew the power that they had, the power that stories have to become medicine, that they will insert in you, in your mind, in your bloodstream, in your veins, so that you can need it at some point when it becomes important to you. And you won't even know when, but you will discover that. So when they were telling stories as a boy, you learn certain techniques that now I utilize in my work and try to show the wisdom of this place. If you're telling a story orally in Mende, in my village, when we sit around the fire, and you wanted to explain that people were running, somebody was running, he ran or she ran, there are several ways that you will say this. You can say, he or she ran, tuk, 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 tuk. Or he or she ran, kuju, 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 kuju. These are two different things. Now, when you say tuk tuk tuk, it means the person ran during the day. Kuju 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 is at night. Now, pay attention because during the day there are other sounds that are occurring. So birds are singing, maybe a blacksmith is doing something, somebody. So the sounds amplified so you can hear somebody's footsteps. At night, when it's quieter, when somebody runs past your bedroom, you can hear their footsteps are much heavier. You can hear it because the night is quieter, so you can feel it. So when somebody's telling a story and they say, and he ran, kuju kuju kuju, you know it's nighttime. They don't need to explain to you. So I try to bring some of these techniques in this novel, in my fiction. So what I'm going to do now is to read the opening of the book for you. I introduce you to this character called Mama Kadi, who comes into Imperi, which is the setting of this novel, and start to live there again. And she's the first that arrives. It's chapter 1. It is the end, or maybe the beginning, of another story. Every story begins and ends with a woman, a mother, a grandmother, a child. Every story is a birth. She was the first to arrive where it seemed the wind no longer exhaled. Several miles from town, the trees had entangled one another. Their branches grew toward the ground, burying the leaves in the soil to blind their eyes, so the sun would not promise them tomorrow with its rays. It was only the path that was reluctant to cloak its surface completely with grasses, as though it anticipated it would soon end its starvation for the warmth of bare feet that gave it life. The long and winding paths were spoken of as snakes that one walked upon to encounter life, or to arrive at the places where life lived. Like snakes, the paths were now ready to shed their old skins for new ones, and such occurrences take time with the necessary interruptions. Today, her feet began one of those interruptions. It may be that those whose years have many seasons are always the first to rekindle their broken friendship with the land, or it may just have happened this way. The breeze nudged her bony body, covered with a tattered cloth, thin and faded from many washings, toward what had been her town. She had removed her flip-flops, set them on her head, and carefully placed her bare feet on the path, waking the caked dirt with her gentle steps. With closed eyes, she conjured the sweet smell of the flowers that would turn to coffee beans, which the sporadic breath of the air fanned into the air. It was a freshness that used to overcome the forest and find its way into the noses of visitors many miles away. Such a scent was a promise of to a traveler of life ahead, of a place to rest and quench one's thirst, and perhaps ask for directions if one was lost. But today, the scent made her weep, starting slowly at first with sobs that became a cry of the past, a cry, almost a song to mourn what has been lost, while its memory refuses to depart, and a cry to celebrate what has been left, however little, to infuse it with residues of old knowledge. She swayed to her own melody, and the echo of her voice first filled her, making her body tremble, and then filled the forest. She lamented for miles, pulling shrubs that her strength allowed and tossing them aside on the path. Finally, she arrived at the quiet town without being greeted by the crows of cocks, the voices of children playing games, the sound of a blacksmith hitting a red-hot iron to make a tool, or the rise of a smoke from fireplaces. Even without these signals of a time that seemed far gone, she was happy to be home, that she found herself running to her house, her legs suddenly gaining more strength for her age. Alas, as she reached her home, she began to weep. The song from the past had abruptly left her tongue. Her house had been burnt a while back, and the remaining pillars were still dark from the smoke. Tears consumed her deep brown eyes and slowly rolled down her long face until her sharp cheekbones were soaked. She wept to accept what she knew had happened, but also to allow her tears to drop on the ground and call on those gone to return in the spirit form. So this is the opening of a character called Mama Kadi, who goes back, who's the older lady who goes back. So this character I really envision thinking about what my grandmother, what it would have felt like for her to return home after the war and to try and walk that path again, and what would be going. So I try to imagine that. So you have this woman, then you have two elders who arrive again, two men. And so the three elders first started living in the town, and then people start coming slowly. So you have children who came without parents. You have a young woman who came with a child that she had gotten from the war, and she doesn't want to look at the child because the child reminds her of other things. And then you have a teacher who comes with his family. There are two teachers, Benjamin and Bakari, the center of the story, and how this family tried to keep themselves together. One point that I'll make before I read the last quick excerpt and then open it up to discussion is this. I wanted to make people understand how is it that when you return to this place, you will try to move towards a future when the past is still pulling at you and very new. But more importantly, how do you hold on to what means the most to you in the most uncertain time of your life? And what does that do to your humanity? What does that do to you as a person? What does that do to your spirit? What are your morals? What kind of ethical and moral standards do you hold on to in these times of your life, and for what? And what do they mean to you? So this is really what I'm trying to get at. And also, lastly, I really, before I read the last piece, I also wanted people to understand, because I also travel a lot in my work and speak to people sometimes, and I hear the way people speak about peace and happiness is the absence of any challenge. That's not possible. So, except if you're making Hollywood films, it could be possible. But in real life, it's not. And that doesn't mean that you're happy. Happiness is not the absence of every day in your life you will face a challenge. Some may be smaller and some may be much bigger than others. But in the backdrop of that, people love each other deeply. They create families. And they have fantastic times of fun and things, as you see in this novel. So that's really what I wanted to paint. And also, our measure of happiness, or mine, or yours, or any, it's not the same as somebody else's. My grandfather, when he was alive, his happiest moment, as he expressed to me ever in his life, was in the evening when he would sit on his chair and he would see all his children and grandchildren playing around and hanging around together and talking to each other. That life, to him, this was the best any human being can hope for in your life. That was his happiness, you know. So I wanted to have people understand that, you know, because oftentimes when we look at these countries, we try to say, oh, well, people are not doing this, so therefore they are not happy. The measurements are different, you know. Anyway, with that said, I'm going to introduce you to a few more characters, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. So chapter 2 sort of brings in a few more characters that you would meet and how they all came. One of the characters I had a difficult time, it was a challenge to write, I would say. A rewarding one was one called Connor, who's one of the former child soldiers who returned, and is a very strong fellow. And then he starts to resist some of the things that the new challenges that are occurring in his community, and also try to maintain his own dignity. But he was doing it in ways that some may perceive as violence, but it wasn't. He was just trying to stand up. So what was difficult to write about is trying to walk that fine line of somebody standing up for their own convictions, but without endorsing violence. So that was very difficult to manage. But I did the best that I could. And also what I would say to is that in the oral tradition is that when you write a story, it is no longer yours. When you tell a story, when you share it, it becomes whoever encounters it, and what they do, it is up to them. But the most important thing is that they pass it along, because the stories have to live from vessel to vessel in order for them to prosper, because they outlive all of us. So that's the point. So whatever you hear, I hope you can pass it on to somebody and encourage them, and so on and so forth. All right? Which equals buying more books and everything. Anyway, now let me read chapter 2, and then we'll have a discussion. People had been away from Imperi for 7 long years. During that time, the days had become drawn out as they waited restlessly to start living again. They had seen the fire of war lick their town so viciously that even when the war was said to be over, it took them over a year and more for some before they started thinking about returning home. It wasn't that they didn't want to go back. Rather, war had taught them not to trust what they heard on radios, through rumors, and for those who lived in the capital city, read in newspapers. They knew firsthand that the madness didn't cease immediately just because someone signed a peace accord or some useless ceremony honored those who were not close to the realities they had just proclaimed to have stopped with a signature. it would take months for the fighters in the deep countryside to get the message, and even longer to believe in it. Those who returned were coming from refugee camps in the outskirts of cities and in neighboring countries where they had waited all these years in tarpaulin houses to go home or start life somewhere else. The waiting had no fixed end date. Every life seemed on hold. Nothing was sure in either direction. Everything was temporary, and yet it went on for years, no one wanting to accept that it could become permanent. We are permanently waiting for the temporary war that is nearing 10 years to end, a musician has said in a popular song. Some people couldn't wait in one place, so they wandered about, making themselves vulnerable to other exploitations. Nothing had been easy for anyone. Children born toward the end of the war had no understanding of it. By the time they could form memories, the guns had silenced, and no one wanted to explain what had happened because they didn't want to remember or they couldn't find the right words. There were other children, though, who had known only war, since they were born in it. No matter how, they were all returning to Imperi. They began to arrive in groups when the night gave birth to a day brighter than the previous ones. Mama Kadi, Pa Moiwa, and Pa Kainesi had woken earlier than usual before the crow of the only cock that had begun to announce the life of another day. They were resting from their daily task, sitting on logs at the edge of the older part of town, watching the road, summoning those who hesitated to return. Today, this morning, the road spat out people from refugee camps, towns, villages, hiding places deep in the forest that had become homes, and from wandering, and from many other places where the world now found their presence sour, and where they could no longer see the growth of their shadows. Now, what I said, what I was saying earlier is that to say where the world now found their presence sour, it means that where they cannot find peace, and they cannot see the growth of their shadows. It means that they're not moving forward at all, because when the day starts, right, in the morning when the day starts, the sun hasn't come up yet. Your shadow is very small, right? As the day progresses, it follows you, it circles you, and it grows in a certain way. So that shows the day is progressing, right? So as a kid, so I'm trying to use some of this lyrical language from Mendy. That being said, I want to thank you, Dosfa, for your attention, and I'm going to leave some time now to answer some questions. Please, as it was asked of you, please do come to the front and stand at the mic and ask your question. And if for some reason you don't do that, I'll rephrase it so that it will benefit those who may watch it. So who is the first? Yes.
Hi there. Okay. So congratulations to you, my dear brother. Some of us are here from Oberlin, so we're from Oberlin.
All right, look at that.
And so
Oberlin
we're just very excited to be here and support your book. I want to ask you about the radiance that you had long before you even wrote your first book, because many of us, including myself, had no idea you had this experience while we were, going to classes back in Ohio. And after reading your book, I'm like, I cannot believe it. You are the most humble, sweetest person I've ever met. I mean, I would never believe you had gone through what you have gone through. So can you talk to us about how you kept your radiance throughout this process?
Yes. Well, Radiance of Tomorrow, the title is in the book. I didn't want to talk about it because I want you to discover it, so I didn't want to give it away. But when I before I came to the United States, I was adopted in a family here, and I had come out of the war in Sierra Leone, and in Sierra Leone I had gone through a lot of rehabilitation, through Western methods and traditional methods and all of it, And it's actually the same place where my spirit was broken was the same place that it was rebuilt and sparked again before I actually came to the United States. And starting living here and having opportunities actually, so it had been many years for me to be where I was, to be, sort of soft and quiet. I wasn't like that for a long time. So, but sometimes when people meet me and then they read my story and then they think, I just came from it immediately. But it has been many years. I worked really hard to move away from that, to to refocus some of the things that I've experienced so that they no longer affect me negatively, you know. But even when I was at Oberlin, I was still having the same flashback and nightmares, but I didn't allow anybody to see that. If you will, it's one of the being in the army, even though I was dragged into it, I would not want it for anybody. It also built certain characteristics within me that I'm appreciative of, and one of them is not to show anybody any weakness in any way at all. So because of that, I was able to manage what was inside me, so that all my, but also really I found a lot of the other things. For example, when I was in high school, I found the things that people were worried about were very silly sometimes. So I just laughed. I remember I was at the United Nations International School in New York, and I had made the mistake in winter of going to school 2 days in a row with the same shirt, and some kids started laughing. And I thought to myself, when you're running from the war, you could be wearing the same shirt for years, I didn't even sweat, the day before. And so another young person would have devastated anything. I just thought it was so funny, that they could. But then I didn't say anything at all. And for me, really, I had to manage a lot of things, when I came to New York, and I started school, first of all, when my mother, the woman who adopted me, started taking me to to schools for me to get in, nobody would take me because I didn't have a report card. I couldn't show that I'd been in school. So most people would say to me, well, how can we prove? I said, well, I know I've been in school. I'm the only proof you got. It's not like when you're running from war, you're thinking, I should take my report card, and keep it with me, to show it to somebody. So I used to laugh, I say, what's wrong with these people, seriously, Anyway, so actually the first essay I ever wrote in the United States was why I did not have a report card. This is what got me into school and got me a scholarship, because everybody was asking me, where's your report card? I said to myself, okay. So when I was in school also, even though I got into the school, they had a parent-teachers association meeting, and they told the parents that we have this kid in your school who has this background. And some parents said, no, we don't want him, it's dangerous for our kids. And they went on and on. So they convinced them that it wasn't, but I knew everybody was watching me. So I couldn't even play fight. I was on a soccer team. So if I play fight, everybody thought, he's a former child soldier, he must be losing it. So I knew everybody was watching me in that way. So I thought to myself, all right, fine. Because I also thought, okay, whatever I do would reflect whoever is accepted, who comes from this experience as well. So I felt that responsibility. So I conducted myself, but I also just smiled at things and moved on with my life. So really, it wasn't that I was ashamed of telling people. It was just that I felt that it wasn't a conversation I could have with people in a few minutes. And if they didn't understand the context, they would misunderstand so many things, For example, if we were at lunch and I said to people, well, I used to be a child soldier in Sierra Leone. Let's go back to class now. So I just didn't say much, Anyway.
Abua.
Bisya, kami
Kangwoma.
All right. Nice.
Your Mende is still good.
My Mende. Thank you.
I send you greetings from Cindy and Michael and Seattle. They're looking forward to seeing you at the end of the month. Yes. So for Schools for Salon. But listen, real quick, the question I have is this. Mm-hmm. You're writing a novel. You're on a quest. You're in a journey yourself inside as you're trying to express your feelings, your thoughts, your emotions. What is in this journey? What surprised you about yourself? What did you learn that you had no idea that you had inside or something on the outside?
Well, first of all, the distinction between the memoir and the novel was that during writing the memoir, I didn't want to do it because I was going to places that I knew were difficult and familiar to me psychologically and emotionally. So, but writing a novel, I couldn't wait to go back into it because I created the world and I was going there. But what was really interesting for me is it allowed me to step into and imagine being in the shoes of the different people who had experienced the war in different capacities in Sierra Leone, and not just from the side that I know best. So that for me made me discover a lot of things. For example, what it would feel like to be an elder during the war, and what that could have done to people psychologically, to see this land that you grew up in and your grandchildren become literally your enemy and people you fear, because from the elder's mouth, in any world where adults fear children, something has gone significantly wrong. So how do you do that? So for me to try and understand what that means, And of course, I'm doing that also thinking that I was one of those children that people feared. So I know what that fear looked like on their faces. So that was really some of the things I discovered. So I discovered what it meant to be amputated, what it meant to be a grandmother, what it meant to be a mother during the war and try to keep your family together, a father, what it meant to be a brother who had families alive and what the difficulty was to keep them, to lose them and find them again, and various other things I learned about my culture. But also, the more I write, one fascinating thing for me is that I always discover the intricacies, beauty, and wisdom in my culture and my traditions and my language. I rediscover more and more. I know it already, but I discover it more and more. And so that really thrills me quite a lot, Yeah. Yes, my brother. Yes. How are you, man?
Kusha.
Kusha, everybody.
Yeah. Brother Ishmael, it's a pleasure always to meet you. He's my brother, and I've met him a few times, and we have hung out in New York. We also met at the UN. That's great. Well, I'm not here really to talk about child soldiers. I'm here to talk about children who struggle a war that we are not familiar about what a soldier is. In fact, combining the word child and a soldier, for me, who have been through that struggle, I don't understand. Because a soldier is somebody who is willing to serve, whether in a patriotism or whether in a form of defense. A child is a kid who is innocent. So when you combine those two words, I find it very difficult to understand the chemistry behind it. Anyway, but you mentioned one thing, that going back home, a village where your parents were murdered. What's the desire behind it? Why are you going? Are you going to revenge? Are you going with love? Are you going with anger? And as a young man who also been through that, one thing I also, in the books that you have reading, the first book and the second one that I read briefly about it, is you give people an insight, a story that they really don't understand. The question is, how Ishmael know about all this? Is there anybody who can testify? You cannot testify in a war. Even my mother, who is dead today, she don't know, because when they say a rebel attack here, nobody is going to wait even for their daughters. So, but you helped to give people an insight of a story that's untold, a story that has no real witness, a story that nobody really knows the in-depth of it except you alone who survived. The story of war is not a story that there is any witness except you alone. If anybody stands here and say, I knew what he says is not, I can tell you that go to any magistrate, I can defend myself. I don't need a judge because I was alone. But now in your new novels, you talk about the children. Yes, there was a common language when the war finished called the war done. That was Pakaba, Tijan Kaba. When he signed, he said the war done, meaning the war is finished in Creole. And then people say Sierra Leone is now in peace. Are you really sure? After 11 years with deceptive languages and political deceptive words given to young people, they gave us an ideology that today, even the war is over, psychologically we're still fighting a battle. And you giving us a novel today that reminding people to understand that the war is not over. In fact, the long battle is now to rehabilitate us. Some of us, nobody's happy to talk about what happened. In our culture, African, we are very proud. We have pride inside us. We don't really talk about our. For example, I might be angry. I'm not going to meet you and say, I'm really hungry. Can you give me food? In us, we consider it very weak. In African, when you say you're weak, it's like you're vulnerable. We don't really like talking about it. But you're helping to educate the world, not only the West and the world. And I hope Africans will begin to really read these books, because that will change our mentality. Until our mentalities change, before we can actually see the real peace that we want in our continent. Today, I'm doing some work at the World Bank. I was invited by the African Leadership Academy at the World Bank to interview their graduates. And some of the interviews, I engaged them about how can we approach conflict in our culture. in our. Is that the only means that when we get angry to government, we go to the jungle and start fighting? You know, I actually changed from the instructions they gave me in the interview. I began to engage the young people because it was an opportunity for me to engage my fellow Africans. So I just want to give you applause, and I encourage you to continue to do what you're doing. You're putting Sierra Leone in the map, and I'm here to support you. I have my auntie, the same thing. Thank Americans, they're wonderful people coming to this country with no family, and now have families going to the best schools. Even being at the World Bank, it's an amazing, and you're doing great things. So I just want to encourage you, keep it up. And the story of going back home is an amazing story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brother. Thank you. Just to somebody else can walk up to the mic to ask. What I'm trying to say is that what Salif said is absolutely on point, in the sense that for me, writing, when I wrote the first book, I was a bit. I talked and I went around and I talked to some people, and I began to realize something, is that some people are very interested, particularly I think it's a Western mentality where people are interested in the singular truth. There is no singular truth, in my opinion, and the culture that I'm coming. For example, we're all here tonight, right? When we leave and we render what this evening was, we talk to people about it, our renditions of it, our explanations will be very different, but they're all truthful based on our experiences here, right? If you see a car goes by, say it's a Toyota or Peugeot, you react to it not because of that instant, but based on layers and layers of your experience and things in your memory. So when you react, when you write that reaction, it is truthful to yourself, you know. So sometimes when you're writing about places like that most people don't go to, and some journalists will say to you, well, how can we know that you were there? Well, as a journalist, you insert yourself in the places to write about it. So you come with your recording devices and your notepad. But when you're running from a war, experiencing something, you don't have the luxury of that, right? So afterwards, you remember it to the best of your ability. But for me, the writing, really, what I'm trying to do is this, and the point I want to make is this. Any culture, any country, any society that allows others to tell their stories and not take charge of telling their own stories, you're in big trouble, because what you do, you give people the permission to actually dictate how your life is, how you live your life, and even prescribe your dreams. So for me, writing about Sierra Leone, about any African country, is to take back our story so that we can say it in our own words, so that we can write about our own mistakes and do that in our own voice, in our own words, and not give that to anybody. It's been too long since we allowed other people to speak about us who do not even know us. You have people who go to a place like Sierra Leone for 1 day or 2 days, stay in the best hotel in the capital city, and they'll write a profile on the country. You can't even know an ant in that amount of time, you know. Even if you have a big microscope, you watch it. But then it will become the factual thing about Sierra Leone. I've witnessed events on the street in Sierra Leone where kids were joking with a journalist. They were, Creole, one of our languages, the language changes a lot. There are always different slangs in it every now and then. And at this point, one of the slangs was that they would say, drink, which means they're pulling your leg, which pretty much means we are giving you dirty water and you're drinking it. And he wrote it down because he understood, And a few years later, I was reading to the internet. I read a lot about Sierra Leone. It was there. Oh, in Sierra Leone, when they give you dirty water, you should drink it. I'm like, what is that? Absolutely not true. It completely missed the concept, right? But so what happens now when somebody like me come and I write, I have to challenge that and undo it, and then try to, and then it becomes. People say, well, that's not really. Oh, you're too subjective. You're not objective, and all this. But can an outsider also be that? Can you see with that your own lenses? And it's okay to write and say, I'm only viewing you through my lens. That's okay. You can say that. But it's when you make the sweeping statement and say, well, in Sierra Leone, everybody's like this, or in Africa, everybody's like this. It's always not. So anyway, for me, writing is that task, to really write about places that are unknown. Like my village, for example, in Sierra Leone, most people even in Sierra Leone, don't know in Freetown, don't know where it is. So but it's a great thing. It's what makes me who I am. I'm a village boy from the river, and here I am. Anyway, who has another question?
Hi, I had a more articulate question. I just wanted to take a second. I really appreciate that you were willing to get up and share. I feel like that's part of what you're saying about everyone telling their story and having a conversation. And I get nervous talking in front of a mic, and I'm not even saying anything personal, but it just, like, on a personal level, you've really given me a lot to think about, and I appreciate that, and probably other people too. I'm also an Oberlin alum from the creative writing department, so maybe we can have and my question is, Gary Scheinhart was here last night, and he talked about how he wrote a lot about his experience through fiction and wrote a memoir, and he was like, well, now I showed my whole hand, so now I've got to do something else. And you sort of went the other way. You wrote your memoir, now you're doing fiction. And I was explaining to a couple coworkers who you were, and I realized after I said it, came out, I said, oh, he's that child soldier who wrote the book who's at Starbucks. And they're like, how can you sum up one person like that with these, like, totally contradictory things? And I was thinking, as a writer, we usually say the writer who writes about, and then certain people get sort of pigeonholed as that child soldier. And as you move into fiction, and I know you're also really active with humanitarian aid, do you feel like at some point maybe you're going to try something completely different, or that these are issues that you're really passionate about and you're okay being the writer who writes about this issue because it's always going to be part of what you imagine writing about?
Well, I think of myself as the writer that writes about things that people do not know about, and I would want them to understand it. So whether that becomes about child soldier war, about somebody amputated, that's what it is, And like you rightly said, is that I think whether you like it or not, that's what happens. When you write, the first thing that hits the public that you get known for is people keep you in that for the rest of your life. I will give you an anecdote. I was at NYU a few years back at a talk that Elie Wiesel was giving. A fantastic writer, has won the Nobel Prize for Literature, all the rest of it, right? Literally, he was introduced as the Holocaust boy. Here comes this old fellow. And I kept thinking to myself, well, that's what's going to happen to me, like, I may be like 70 years old, and they'll be like, and now comes the former child soldier. I'll be like, I'm 70 years old, But what happens is that at some point you got to realize that, okay, it's not coming from a place where people, not necessarily a bad thing, is that's the first memory they have of you, and for some reason they can't detach themselves from it. Or maybe they're also trying to explain the fact that you were there and now you're here to show people the triumph of the human spirit itself, but they don't have the way to sum it up in very well, so they just say that. So for me, it doesn't bother me. I laugh all the time, because I think, I know people are thinking beyond that. But I write about my country because there are a lot of things about it that people don't know that I want to share. I haven't written much. I've written short stories about being in the United States, but not very much. Even though I've lived there for a number of years, I still feel I need to observe a little bit more to be able to write about it in the depths that I would. But in my country, I know it. It's in me. Even when I'm not there, it's in my blood, it's in my spirit. So I want to share that part of the world that is less known about, so people can understand it, not just Sierra Leone during the war, but before the war, after the war, and all the in-betweens and the intricacies that come with it, So that's really what I try to do. Of course, I do a lot of things. Actually, I never studied writing. I went to Oberlin and I took a few writing courses, but I never got a major in writing. So I'm a political scientist by background. For some reason, people don't even know that. They forget about it, but it's okay, So, but anyway, so that's my background, yeah.
Also, I don't know if just because there's so many Obies here, they changed the mascot to the albino squirrel. Yes.
This is a little Oberlin.
It is angry looking. It's an angry albino squirrel, so I suggest you look for it. But
all right, we're going to write a petition to change the mascot back.
Hi, this is Marian Mahmoud, also from Oberlin. I took my first class in Oberlin was a creative writing class with Ishmael. So my question is, how much of what's going on socially, politically, economically, even in the psyche of the Sierra Leonean people is reflected in your novel?
There's a lot of it. And of course, when I write about political, economical situations, I never put them in those terms because I would think it would be very boring, and also that then people don't understand what it does to the human being who's experiencing it. And this is not a critique about who is in power, whatever, or this, that. I'm just telling the story about what it means for the ordinary citizen who does not live in the capital city where the NGOs are mostly situated, who lives in the deep countryside. What impact of all of what's going on in the country, what does it have on their lives? And what does it do to them as a human being? And how do they accept it? So I talk about a lot of things. And so you see the family, the main family that's in this novel, they move to different parts of the country as a way so that you can see what's going on in other places, trying to find a suitable place to live. And the challenges that come with that, and here and there, and so you see that overview as well. Of course, I'm aware of all of this because I go home quite often. I always tell people that I'm a Sierra Leonean with some American tendencies, but besides that. But so my home is my home. I love it. But I'm also, when I write about it, I want to be honest about certain things, and be able to speak for the people. Maybe the way to sum it would be in the words of if Albert Camus, if I can remember the particular quote. It says that the role of a writer is to be in the service, I'm paraphrasing, to be in the service of those who suffer history, not those who make history. So for me, when I write, that's how I think about it. So I'm writing for the ones that are on that side of it, not the ones who are making history, because they will write the beautiful stories and the flowery ones. Anyway, yes.
We have time for one or maybe two more questions.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about how you feel about how the media portrays, I guess, the war and child soldiers.
Please, yes.
I'm just wondering how you feel about how the media portrays the issues that you discuss in your books.
Well, the first book, actually, the first book that I wrote, A Long Way Gone, came out of that frustration. The way the media was speaking about my country and about somebody who had been a child soldier. The way people presented Sierra Leone, and this was people's first sort of introduction to this country. So it was Sierra Leone equals civil war, amputation, madness, war. And I was thinking to myself, well, first of all, there's nowhere in the world where people just wake up one morning and just be like, we should really fight today because it could just be so good. There are things that lead to it. But oftentimes when people write about it, they sensationalize it and generalize it to the point that, so I was very upset with that. So I actually started writing my first book in reaction to that, to explain to people the context of things. Most importantly, the human context of it, And even during all of this war, there are Sierra Leoneans who were heroes, who were saving other Sierra Leoneans, who were taking in other Sierra Leoneans. The rehabilitation center that I went to was run by Sierra Leoneans who had no psychological degree, but they did a great job. I mean, I'm standing here, so it's proof. Anyway, so there are all of these things. For me, I wanted to give that context so people can understand that it's not that easy. A few years, is it a year ago or less, even when the whole Coney 2012 thing came out, it was a similar thing, where people feel that they have this desire, they can just generalize anything that has to do with Africa, and people will just ignore it. Well, guess what? It's not going to happen anymore because there are a lot of us around paying attention. We all have Twitters and mobile phones now. So when you say something about us that's not correct, we will tell you. Definitely, it's not like back in the day when you kind of do it and people just, So for me, all my writing is really to try and come and correct certain things, but also just to write a story and put it in this landscape to show the beauty, the strength, the humility of my people. Because for many years, that hasn't been shown a lot. We've been shown as weak. For example, people talk about African women sometimes as, they talk like they're weak. I say, you've never met an African woman. If you think African women are weak, I always say, I'm like, serious? Whenever they portray, I'm like, well, I'm not sure which one they met, but that's the ones I have encountered, Anyway, yes, one last question. Sir.
Yes, okay. I am pleased to see you here this evening. And my question is, in your book, of course I haven't read it yet, but what role does the church play in all of this? Religion. Does that have any influence in your writing, or is that an important factor in Sierra Leone? Or
Religion is a factor in Sierra Leone, but it's not. It's mentioned in the book a little bit, and it's an underpinning for a lot of people. One thing that most people don't know about Sierra Leone is this: I would bet on it that we are the most religiously tolerant country in the world. During the war, there was never a religious aspect to it, and in my family, there are Christians and Muslims alike. Nobody tries to convert. Even when I was a kid growing up, my grandfather was an imam. He was best friends with a pastor. So I actually went to a Christian school, and I learned the Bible and I learned the Quran, and both. So I would go to church and I would go to the mosque. And we have a joke in Sierra Leone, something that I would say, yeah, you take whatever religion you can because you don't know. On Judgment Day, you don't know who's right, It may turn out that these guys were right and the other guys were right, and then you'd be like, well, I'm part of them, So we're very open to that sense. But people believe in godliness. They believe in godliness as a God that exists, but they also believe in the fact that within us, within our environment, there's also godliness that exists in the spirits and in other things. So everybody goes and does their local tradition as well. But religion, and in fact, one way to measure it, and there's some Sierra Leoneans here, when you go in our capital city or anywhere, you see the vehicles that go by. They are called pura pura, which is the transportation vehicles. The slogans on them can pretty much echo the sentiment of what people believe in God. It'd be like, God is great, no condition is permanent. They have all the little sayings that goes on. So you see that there is that belief that's there already. Yeah. Okay, so with that said, thank you so much again for coming. And